Hello, everyone. Welcome to session 2 of PE 335, Theory of Coaching Strength and Conditioning. Today, we're going to talk about biomechanics of resistance exercise. Biomechanics of resistance exercise is simply defined as the study of forces and their effects on the human body. In resistance exercise, biomechanics helps us understand how load placement, joint angles, and lever systems impact performance, the ability to move certain objects, and how the body handles it. Coaches can use biomechanics to optimize performance. It can help with reducing the risk of injuries, along with improving and teaching proper technique with all facets of athletes. This really sets the foundation for all strength training principles that we'll discuss down the road, some of which we discussed in the last session and in future sessions from here on out. First, we'll talk about the anatomical planes of motion or of the body. You've got three major: sagittal, which divides the body in the middle from left side and right side. This is usually with squats and with curls. Frontal plane, which divides the front and the back, or the anterior and the posterior of the body. This, in pathways of this, would be lateral raises, side lunges, stuff that goes out to the side with abduction and adduction. And then you have transverse, which divides the upper and the lower. So this would be a bench, any kind of rotational med ball toss, any rotations that you may do with a cable, reverse lunges with the twist portion. It really is defined in those. Understanding these planes helps you and ensures that you create a balanced program across the different movements. No sport is just going to go in one plane. Volleyball players will move in all facets. So soccer, baseball, basketball, track and field, depending on the event in which you're doing. So understanding that you have to train more than one plane in a program is key to creating the athlete as a whole and lowering that risk of injury. If you just train one plane and you ignore the other, that plane and that movement may become at higher risk for injury. Next, we'll talk about the skeletal system and lever mechanics. So we mentioned levers in very minimal state on the last session. Levers with fulcrum at a joint, the effort, which is the muscle, and then the load, which is the weight. So we have different classes. First class, which is tricep extension movement. Second class could be a calf raise. And then the third class could be a bicep curl. Your first class could also be, as the image demonstrates, something like raising your head up at the neck. Your axis becomes the lower portion of the axial skeletal, just below the head. As you raise your chin may have the force going down, and it creates a motion where it's going left to right, right to left, up and down, down and up. Most classes, or most levers in the body, are third class. They favor the speed and the range of motion over force. Most of your body's going to emphasize that speed and range of motion. Next slide, we'll talk about muscle actions in resistance exercise. This is what you'll hear most when it comes to creating training programs, especially off of a block system, very traditional linear block systems. You'll hear it in triphasic. You'll hear it in many facets of strength conditioning, which is the concentric, eccentric, and isometric. Concentric is the muscle shortening. So in a squat, as demonstrated, it is the up phase where force is being produced out onto the weight, or the weight is being pushed away. Same with a bicep curl. Concentric is bringing it up, same as if you would be pushing up on the weight on a squat. The eccentric phase, or the lowering phase, is on the way down, which is why you hear eccentric squats, tempo squats, bringing the weight back down. Same with the bicep curl. If somebody says do an eccentric curl, you're more focused on the weight coming down. Eccentric pull-ups, counting down 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 on the way down. It's the lengthening under a load. Then the iso phase is a pausing phase. It is where there is no lengthening, change, there's no movement. It is a static position. Wall sits being very popular, isometrics, pause squats being an isometric. It's where the time under tension is solidified and stayed at a certain point. There's no pushing or lowering of the weight. Eccentric phases create greater force and hypertrophy potential, which is why you usually see eccentric at the very beginning of a program. Eccentric loading may be 5, 4, 3 seconds long. Some programs may have an eccentric phase that goes much longer than that, but it's usually early on in the program where you're building that hypertrophy base. You're building a solid body composition from that standpoint. As I said, it's valuable in hypertrophy, but it must be carefully programmed due to the muscle damage potential. If you do it wrong and you overdo eccentric loading, it's hard to come out of that eccentric loading properly. If you stay in it for too long, if you have too long of periods for the tempo, it becomes detrimental rather than increasing the potential for greater increase on the body. Next, we'll talk about the force, the torque, and the movement arms. Now, this is something that may trip a few people up. Torque is the force times the movement arm. So a longer moment arm increases the difficulty. So I'm going to use the back squat and the front squat as an example here. You could do many different things. You could do a lever deadlift. If anybody's ever seen the very popular video of people, especially in Europe, doing a deadlift down a log. If I have let's take this pen. If I have this pen and I have a weight on this side and I start here, I can pick this weight up relatively easy from this standpoint. And then if I back up, it'll get a little bit heavier. If I back all the way up to here, it's going to be very heavy. And if I come back here trying to pull this weight up from here, this weight is going to take a lot of force for me to pull it back up. So really depending on where your force is and where the load is matters. So as I said, the longer the arm, the weight's here and you're trying to lift from here and to bring this weight up, it's going to take a lot of force. But if I come all the way over here and just pick it up, it's very easy. This is seen in landmines. If you go all the way down by the base of the landmine and try to pick something up, it's going to be virtually impossible. But if you go all the way up to the weight, you can press it, row it, squat it. The weight becomes much easier to lift from that standpoint. With the squat, it's the same. If I put the weight in the front squat position, your knees over toes are going to be greater with the more upright position of the spine. If you lean too far forward, and your bar path will no longer be over the midfoot, which will create you to fall forward. It creates that moment arm to be falling into that increased position of going forward. Same thing with a back squat. If you have a high back squat, your chest is going to be more upright. Your knees over toes are going to be greater. You're going to have a more lower shin angle because of how high the bar is as you come down. If the bar is lower on your back, you can bend more and create that same path as described in, or as shown in illustration. All of these bar paths are still going down mid-foot. Now they change depending on where they are on the thigh or the quad, but everything goes down midfoot and everything stays relatively even from that standpoint. The shin angle changes along with the hip angle as well. Um, and as the diagram says, coaches can manipulate mechanics for adaptation. The more bent a athlete may be, especially in Bulgarians or squats, tend to lend more to glute and hamstring activation. With more chest upright, you may have more quad adaptations from that movement forward. So it really depends on what we're trying to target, what kind of movements we're trying to do, what kind of athletes we're going to have for that movement. Olympic lifters may have more of an upright, high bar position squat. Power lifters may have more low bar, trying to lift a heavier load from that standpoint. The next slide continues that to show you the differences between the front squat and the back squat using the same athlete, the same amount of weight. Now, Dmitry Klokov is one of the highest ranked weightlifters from Russia in history. Both of these videos are of a 250 kilogram or 552 pound squat, but one is from the front and one is from the back. You can see the shin angles are different based on the upright position of the spine. One is a front squat where he would be catching a load in a clean. For his sport, he's more upright. He has a lower shin angle from that standpoint when he presses off. On the back squat, he still keeps a relatively higher bar, but it is slightly lower than it would be if it was up on his clavicles in that resting position from a clean. So he's able to have slightly more bend in his hips to meet that adaptation of that weight. It also creates a different joint angle when it comes to his hips. His hips sink lower in the front squat than they would in the back squat, depending on how much load is on his spine over his toes. So he's really staying over that midfoot regardless of how he's squatting, but it moves depending on his hip angle as well. Next, we'll talk about joint biomechanics. So we've got the knee, the patellar tendon, moment arm is critical. It allows for powerful quadricep action, so it'll extend the quad or help extend the quad and create that kind of movement through the knee to the lower limb. The hip, it's a large range of motion. It's got a very wide range of motion. It's a major contributor to the posterior chain strength. So its focus is on that posterior chain. Then we've got the shoulder, which is highly mobile, but it's also very unstable, which is why I use that as the diagram. The shoulders can raise up in a dumbbell shrug. They can pull back in a face pull or a row. They can roll back, as some used to do on dumbbell shrugs. They can roll forward depending on how you need to bench. Benching movement, for example, you bench up, and if you're going to re-rack, you're going to roll your shoulders back to allow that weight to be raised. They can also come out to the side. They can go forward. They can come up. They can come down. They can move backwards. It really just depends on the movement that you're doing, but that creates that low stability, and the injury risk becomes a little bit more intense. So understanding how to train that to become a little bit more stable through proprioception, through proper movement, understanding the mechanics in which it moves is very important. And as I said, program exercise design must balance through mobility and stability for joint health. If I were to just train an athlete to do only lateral raises or only front raises or only bus drivers, I'd be neglecting all the other aspects of movement of the shoulder, especially in sports like volleyball, where they'll have to come over the top. They have to raise with both. They have to hold steady for the incoming ball. They may have to dive and land on the shoulder and have that stability to perform that. Football players have to be able to block and push somebody off them. They have to go up to catch a ball. They have to be hit in the shoulder and be able to take and absorb force. So it really just depends on what sport it is, how they need to move, how much they're going to move, and which movements are going to be more beneficial for them. Because again, as I said in the last video, we're not training bodybuilders. And if you are, that's great. You can focus on the muscle, but you still need to focus on movement. If you only do a shoulder press for 8 weeks and then you bring in a Viking press or an overloaded bench press and you neglected certain planes of only doing lateral raises or only doing shoulder presses, and then they go to press the force out, a lot of that muscular strength that you built up can lead to injury from that standpoint as well. Next, we're going to talk about strength curves. Strength curves are another one of those that may trip many people up, so I'll try to simplify it as much as I possibly can. You have ascending and descending exercises from what we see in strength curves. We also have bell-shaped. Ascending could be a squat where the strength increases as the joint extends, which is why you see people who maybe at a gym do a half squat with 405 pounds. But if you tell them to squat all the way down, it's not going to happen. Because once the load becomes greater at the bottom, it becomes harder to lift once you pass a certain point, which is why we have the term of a sticking point. Most people have a sticking point of about a fist off their chest for a bench, just above the hips for a squat. If you can extend past that and then stand the weight up, your body's going to be able to ascend that weight at greater force. Descending curve, strength decreases as the joint extends more. So a leg curl or any kind of movement where the weight is far out from the body. So if I have my body extended and I'm going to do a leg curl and my leg is fully extended, I have to use all of the muscle to pull it into a point where I can start to push the weight a little bit more efficiently. And then we have bell-shaped, which are the strongest in mid-range of motion. So if you're doing a bicep curl, at the bottom, the weight may be very heavy to get up, and at the top, it's very easy. But in that middle portion is where you feel the greatest amount of tension for that movement, which is another reason also why you see a lot of isometric holds in bicep curls, more unilateral. Some may say hold a bicep curl in this position while you're strengthening the other arm to really create that muscle fatigue in the midsection of the curl, and then switch arms and hold this arm while you're doing that strengthening of the side. So understanding strength curves allows a coach to match exercises with that force that naturally is capable. So in jumpers for track and field, we will utilize, when we get into the later phases, utilize rack squats in a staggered stance to be able to push high amounts of force in a way that is more ascending than anything else. There will be no descension with this movement. They start at a 3/4 squat, press up as much weight as they possibly can, which is usually closer to 100% to 120% of their max, because it's a more doable exercise from that standpoint. They can produce more force at a higher rate and at a higher body position. So limited range of motion allows them to create more force. I touched on this next slide a little bit in the last section, the neural contributions, mainly on the motor unit recruitment size principle. The more strength you're going to be using, the higher and the greater force production units that you're going to need. So if I'm doing a 1 rep max squat, I'm going to have larger motor units readily available to produce more force for that squat. Endurance exercises where you're doing sets of 10, 12, 20 reps, smaller movement style stuff, lateral raises, front raises, are going to use a lot smaller motor unit recruitment. You have rate coding, which is the higher firing frequency produces the greater force. Again, kind of what I just mentioned. More force, motor unit recruitment that you'll see. With resistance training, adaptations includes improved motor unit synchronization, recruitment, and efficiency. So the more that we train in different varieties, the more that we train the body to do different modalities, the greater efficiency we're going to have in moving, in recruiting the muscle. If you stay stagnant in the same pattern over and over and over again, your body's going to adapt to that force, and it's going to change the recruitment that you're seeing in the body. And then we move on to safety. This becomes more on the coaching technique side. So you have a neutral spine alignment, which can reduce harmful shear forces. If you allow your body to stay neutral as you do any kind of movement, your body is in a more natural state. If you see somebody deadlifting and they really round that back and they're pulling it up, it becomes out of a natural state, and they're creating a longer moment arm to pull that force up on the body and strengthen it, which takes a lot of force, and it puts a lot of shear force onto the spine, which is why you see a lot of spinal injuries when it comes to deadlifting, squatting. If somebody's really starting to bend over and their hips raise faster than the rest of their body does. Again, improper alignment increases injury risk. Knees caving in, depending on what you're doing and what your athlete is detrimental to an athlete. It can cause injury to many parts of the body, not just the knee. And then again, rounding back is what I just said. Applying biomechanics to teach safe lifting mechanics overall. If you're able to teach proper posture, bracing, and controlled movement, it'll help with injury, which is one of the key things that I feel like gets lost in the younger generation, seeing, hey, we need to lift a lot of weight, we need to move a lot of force, we need to do this, we need to do that. You don't. If your body can move in a proper posture, if you are able to brace properly at the right time, if you're able to control your body as a whole, you'll be safer, you'll be able to move better, you'll play your sport better. It's not always about lifting sheer force. It's more about moving that force in proper ways and know how to handle that. And as a strength coach, the cues are the most important thing for injury prevention when it comes to teaching exercises and biomechanics. Again, if you just neglect the safety and the form and only focus on lifting maximal weight, great. You might have slightly stronger athletes, but you're probably going to have more prone to injury athletes. You need to focus on, yes, getting them stronger, getting them faster, but making sure that they're able to hold that load and keep proper posture as they're doing that load. If they're not, lower the weight, lower the movement, find a regression or a progression into that exercise that allows them to more excel in a proper form than just moving sheer weight by itself. Again, biomechanics of key lifts. Squat is hip versus knee dominance and the stance. So if you have somebody who may be a little bit more knee dominant from a standpoint of knees over toes, they may have wider hips, they may have closer feet. Again, all of this really determines on the athlete. So don't train one specific athlete the same way. You may have we have a female soccer player whose feet are very close, knees come straight down. They're able to use a lot of force with their feet right underneath their hips. Others may have their feet slightly wider in a more wide stance, which will activate a little bit more of that glute and that hip. they're still squatting, they still play the same sport. They don't necessarily play the same position always, but it changes depending on which is more dominant for that athlete. Same with bench, bar path, and shoulder mechanics are crucial. If your shoulders, if you're benching and you're very wide, you're going to have a higher risk on that shoulder to produce a lot more force. If you have an elbow in at a 45-degree angle, you'll be able to utilize your back, your chest, your shoulders a lot more depending on how you move. Deadlift, it's a very hip hinge based movement. Again, that lever mechanics and the spinal load are the most important. If your hips raise too fast and your back starts to round, you're going to lose A, the posture standpoint, B, the form, and C, you're going to most likely lose that weight when it gets to loads that you could potentially do in better form. And then you have individual differences like limb lengths, mobility that must be accounted for when you're coaching. I'm not going to squat a 5'7" soccer player the same way I'm going to train our 6'7" men's basketball team. They're going to have different sizes of femurs. Their limbs are going to be significantly different sizes. Their spinal load capacity is going to be different. Everything is going to change depending on how mobile they are, how much longer their limbs are, how much shorter their limbs are, how much more muscle they have, how much more they've been training. A lot of this takes into account when you are coaching, not just let's lift this to lift this. Applying this to a program, you need to match the biomechanics to the sport or to the goal if you go into private training. I can't say we're going to do 100 javelin press with a baseball player holding a barbell lengthwise, pressing up, putting a lot of force onto that shoulder, the wrist, and the elbow as I could with a football player who might not necessarily use the shoulder for the same reason. Baseball is going to be throwing a 5-ounce ball, 6-ounce ball, whatever it may be, at higher velocities for longer durations. Football is going to be blocking 180-pound to 400-pound human beings in repeated stance. They're going to have different motions. One's going to have more of a rotational force. The other one's going to have more of a pressing force on that joint. Using the same joint, but it's going to be a different goal. So understanding what biomechanics are needed for the sport is crucial for injury reduction and the production of force needed for that athlete. Using lever mechanics to scale intensity. Again, if I'm going to do a dumbbell lateral raise and I put all the weight out here in this hand and it comes out into this position, that's a lot of force on this shoulder joint because I'm holding a weight significantly farther out from my body than it needs to be. I'm still doing a lateral raise and I'm still coming up to the side, but the difference is as soon as I bend that elbow, it takes a lot of the force off the shoulder. I can still work a lateral raise from that standpoint without putting my shoulder into higher risk. Program variations to target stability and strength curves. I mention this pretty often. Depending on the sport, your strength curve is going to matter more than anything. From if I need to do ascension, if I need to do descension, if we need to focus on certain parameters depending on how much force the body's going to put. A high jump is going to put a lot of force into one leg to go over a 6-7 foot mark. So training at a higher force is going to be crucial when it gets closer to that peaking point or multiple peaking points. And then stability is crucial for posture, for movement, for understanding how to control the limbs and the body as a whole. Again, all of this maximizes performance and minimizes that risk. If we understand how the body moves and the way it needs to move, we will increase that performance. Again, you don't have to lift a lot of weight. If you move better, you're going to play better. If you can move weight better, you will lower your risk of injury because you're going to be able to produce more force while lowering the risk of injury for yourself. Some of the takeaways from this is understanding it explains how forces act on the body. That's what biomechanics does. The knowledge of levers, the torque, the strength curves, and the muscle actions allows us to be a little bit more precise when we're coaching. Not just, here's a squat, here's a deadlift, here's a bench. We'll do a couple bicep curls and tricep press downs at the end. You'll get your main stuff in, and that's about it. That's not always a bad thing. You can do a lot of great movements when it comes to that, but understanding the sport may need a little bit more demand in timing. It may need more demand on force velocity. You can still do all those methods, but you still have to have the knowledge of, okay, we're going to be in eccentric phase here. We're going to do isos here, concentric here. We're going to add in assisted jumps. We're going to understand that we need to have a higher rate of force off the ground. All of that comes into key. And then applying that knowledge for optimal exercise selection. Kind of what I just said. Understanding that I'm not going to train a volleyball player the same way I'm going to train a soccer player. They are drastically two different sports. Now, some positions may move relatively similar depending on they have to move left, right, they have to jump, they have to go forward, they have to go backward, they have to rotate. But there's also many differences. One's outside on a field, depending on if it's turf or grass. One's inside on a wood or mondo court. One has a 75-yard by 120-yard field. The other one has smaller than a 90-foot court, as it were, with a net in the middle. So you're cutting it in half. So one is more of an anaerobic sport. The other one is more of an anaerobic sport. It really depends on how the body's going to move, what the sport needs, and what you're looking at for that athlete. So the biggest thing I would say for this is understand how the athlete needs to move and understand what they need to do to move. Rarely does anybody need to move a lot of weight on a field, on a court, but they have to be able to absorb a lot of force in order to produce a lot of force. And a lot of that comes down to how much force can they handle. If your biomechanics gets shot and you can't handle force, then that 500-pound squat doesn't matter. If you're able to handle that amount of force in proper biomechanics, you can produce more force as you go forward. So that's the end of this session. There will be an assignment that is linked with this as well on the module listed as Biomechanics and Resistance Exercise for this session. Thank you.